Hello everybody, my name is Georgi Georgiev and I'm the founder of analyticstoolkit.com, an online software which helps data analysts and A/B testing specialists by automating certain tasks and providing statistical calculation tools. I have 15 years of experience in online marketing, data analysis, statistics, and both as a consultant and working on my own projects. The topic I want to cover today in today's session is how to test if my website has a small number of users, since this question actually comes up quite frequently in discussions and Q&A sessions about statistics and A/B testing. It is most often posed after using a sample size calculator and discovering that, based on current traffic levels, it would take like an inordinate amount of time to perform an A/B test with a particular significance threshold, sample size, and the minimum effective interest. Faced with this challenge, people often wonder what they can do to run the test in a reasonable amount of time. Some notice that increasing the minimum effective interest quickly decreases the required time, but results in very little chance to detect the realistic effect sizes. Others are tempted to lower the significance threshold, as this does result in shorter tests, but are often unsure how low is okay, and practitioners are generally afraid to deviate from the canonical 95% confidence level. Manipulating these three parameters, the significance threshold, the minimum effective interest, and the statistical power, can result in a smaller required sample size, making a test look feasible. But then the question is if it is still justified to run the test given the high risk of a false positive, a false negative, or sometimes even both. Before we continue with the presentation, I'd like to note that this problem is not exclusive to small businesses. If your website only gets a couple of thousands of users per month, or if your email marketing list contains only a couple of thousand emails, then sure, you have an issue with pretty much every test you want to run. However, large corporations and even gigantic corporations such as Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, Booking.com, etc. also face similar issues in many cases, despite the hundreds of millions of users that might be hitting their site on a monthly basis. Divisions within these companies focus on particular user segments, device categories, particular processes, and while a website might have a few hundred million users per month, the user experience being tested might only be used by a few thousand users at best. So it becomes a small sample size problem, as the available number of users per unit time is actually rather limited, despite the overall total huge numbers. So in this video I will cover different ways of making tests viable with a small sample size, as well as consider whether there are cases where it might not be worth A/B testing at all. I want to begin by exploring what defines a successful A/B test. The question we should ask before conducting any A/B test is, based on our finite resources, what is the action we should prioritize in order to improve KPI X in the most cost-effective, sustainable way? Asking this question forces us to think about the return on investment while managing risk ensures sustainability. Defining success in terms of how well an A/B test helps us achieve sustainable growth means that the outcome of the test is not what determines whether it is successful or not. Let me repeat that. The success of an A/B test is not determined by detecting a statistically significant winner and demonstrating a big lift. A test is positive for a business if it allows us to achieve a balance between risk and innovation, if it allows progress to happen under controlled risk. In other words, we're judging success by the positive return on investment achieved over a long run. By this measure, even unsuccessful tests help us, since they've allowed us to experiment without undue risk, and we can then move on knowing that we've done our best in balancing between the need to improve our product and the need to sustain business in the long run. Now, let us consider what components influence the calculation of return on investment. Since ROI equals the effect multiplied by the impact and divided by the cost, we need to ask these three questions to determine the ROI of a test. What is the total revenue which could be impacted by our planned action? What is the expected positive effect from the action? And finally, what is the expected total cost, including fixed and risk-related costs from taking that action? Optimizing the first two and minimizing the third will result in improving the return on investment. Increasing the effect size or testing change with a larger impact will be ROI positive, only if it can be achieved under a reasonable cost, including risk-related costs. While having a small sample size is an issue from a statistical standpoint, it is also a proxy for having small revenue. And small revenue means that even if the proposed change results in a large effect, the impact in terms of revenue may be small and unable to justify the cost of testing. Given that the revenue we're looking to impact is fixed by the nature of whatever we test, we have only two parameters left in the ROI formula which we can influence. One is the effect size of the tested improvement, and the other is the cost. The cost can further be broken down into several different types. First, we have fixed costs, or costs incurred regardless of the outcome, such as the cost of testing software, the cost of statistical analysis, the cost of design and development of the test variants, and so on. Then we have risk-related costs during the duration of the test. If the variant is better than the control, then the longer a test runs for, the longer we delay launching a superior version to 100% of our users, and thus losing potential revenue. Similarly, if the variant is worse than the control, then the longer we test, the longer we expose a part of our users to an inferior experience, so we lose revenue. Finally, we have costs which depend on the outcome of the test, and they represent the risk of making a bad call and implementing a variant which is in fact losing us money. So now that we know that a successful A/B test is an ROI positive test, regardless of its outcome, let us consider how we can run ROI positive A/B tests with a small sample size by manipulating what is under our control, which is the effect size of our intervention and the different types of costs we just went over. An obvious idea is to simply test something which has a large enough effect so that it outweighs any costs, despite its small impacts. Sure, you can test all your best and greatest ideas for improvement first, but as the expected sizes are large, the test can be run quickly, so you can set a high minimum effect of interest and not worry too much about the high false negative rate for smaller but still relevant effect sizes. But once you've gone through these tests, and once the ideas are not so great looking, now that we're interested in more modest improvements, how can we really, detect these improvements? Now, in certain cases, the ROI positive approach might actually be to simply skip A/B testing altogether. If the perceived business risk is small relative to the associated costs, and if you're more concerned with skipping on a good idea than you are with implementing something which might worsen your results a bit, then the wise decision is to simply implement the idea and move forward. For example, this might be the case when you're fixing obvious technical issues and bugs. In other cases, there might be palpable risk. However, the fixed costs associated with testing may simply be too high to make the business sense to run the test. So, if they negate any expected positive effects, then it doesn't really make sense to run the test. A middle ground between testing and no testing exists when the delay is due to the long duration of the test and when this duration of the test is the greatest cost associated with it. In such cases, we can run a test with the goal of simply making sure that nothing dramatic will occur upon release. In such a case, you can perform a non-inferiority test with a large non-inferiority margin, which will require a drastically smaller sample size, while allowing you to mitigate the worst risk, the worst of a high-impact disaster. Now, another option you have, as we already hinted upon, is to simply accept higher uncertainty in the decision following the test. By reducing the confidence threshold, or equivalently increasing the significance threshold, we can decrease the required sample size somewhat. This comes at the cost of accepting higher risk of false positives following the conclusion of the test. Another option is to reduce the statistical power, which will result in a lower sample size once again. And this time the cost is greater risk of a false negative, we would fail to detect a true improvement with a higher probability. The question is how much uncertainty of either type one can tolerate and still be happy with the trade-off between certainty and speed of testing. In other words, will it be better to test for 12 weeks if this way you have 80% probability of seeing a statistically significant outcome at the 95% confidence level if the true effect is larger than X, or should you instead run the test for only 6 weeks, half the time, with a confidence level of 80% instead of 95%, or maybe you should test with 80% confidence threshold for 12 weeks, the original duration, to increase the statistical power and thus reduce the risk of a false negative. The first obviously leads to less risk of losses due to implementing a winner after the test is completed, but it also exposes you to a larger risk during testing due to the prolonged duration. The second limits the risk during testing while increasing the risk after testing. And finally, the third solution limits the risk of failing to detect a true improvement of a smaller magnitude while keeping risk during testing at the same. But the trade-off is increased risk of incorrectly implementing something which harms performance. Now, which of these solutions has a better return? The difficulty in answering this question is due to the circular feedback from tweaking the parameters and the fact that the answer requires encoding intuitions and predictions about the effect size into a probability distribution. Still, this remains the most mathematically rigorous approach to the issue. Currently, the only tool which allows it to do these calculations is the A/B test ROI calculator at analyticstoolkit.com. Its purpose is exactly to calculate significance threshold and sample size such that these are optimal in terms of return on investment. So the easiest way to explore this is to take this tool for a spin. Now, a third way to make A/B testing efficient with a small sample size is to use a sequential testing procedure. Using sequential testing statistics is a long-term strategy which can result in 20 to 80% faster tests, meaning that a sequential test would, on average, require 20 to 80% fewer users to conduct compared to a fixed sample size test with the same parameters. These numbers are particular to the agile A/B testing method I've been proposing and promoting for the past couple of years, but other available methods are likely to result in comparable savings. In a sequential testing procedure, the data is monitored as it gathers, and the decision to stop is made only if the observation crosses a boundary which is constructed in a way such the procedure maintains the risk control capabilities we want from testing method. Now, that said, it's not like that there are no trade-offs in using sequential procedures, at least with regards to the individual test. So while sequential testing will save you a lot of time on average, under certain conditions, tests might continue on for longer than an equivalent fixed sample size test. Now, the fourth solution you can also consider is to actually change the primary metric used to evaluate the performance of the proposed intervention. For example, if you're testing something which is supposed to increase the add to cart rate, let's say. So instead of testing it as you usually would based on the purchase conversion rate or based on average revenue per user, you can test it based on the add to cart conversion rate instead. So you measure the result on that particular step and do not require the outcome of the primary business metrics such as purchase conversion rate or average revenue per user to be statistically significant as well. Now, due to the better signal-to-noise ratio, such tests can result in significantly smaller required sample sizes. For example, if the add-to-cart percentage is 10%, the signal-to-noise ratio is 1 to 10. If the purchase conversion rate is 2%, then the signal-to-noise ratio is 1 to 50, which is 5 times worse. So this does have a significant effect on the sample size required to achieve equivalent levels of error control and precision on the estimation of the effect size. Now, as with the other three options above, there is a trade-off involved in that the metric is not the one closest to the business bottom line. So what this means is that the effect might dissipate, entirely disappear, or even reversing direction in follow-up steps. So you can increase conversion rate at the add to cart step, but decrease conversion rates on the following steps, or even negatively, they might not be affected, they might be negatively affected, or only slightly positively affected. So there is this assumption of transferability of the effects, and if it does not hold, then the approach cannot be reasonably used. But there are many cases where this assumption is pretty reasonable and of low risk. So a situation in which it is not admissible is, for example, if you use discounts to increase the add to cart ratio. Now, this is obviously very likely to decrease your average revenue per user, so the approach is not applicable in this case. As you can see, no matter which of the above solutions you go for, there is always a trade-off. There is simply no such thing as a free lunch, unfortunately. Furthermore, that's a note I'd like to make, is that due to the economics of scale and the reality of statistical estimation, the smaller a business is, the less likely it is to have a positive expected ROI from A/B testing. A larger business is simply more likely to benefit from A/B testing before implementing due to lower fixed cost per test. And this is the biggest differentiator. So while I don't think it's a coincidence that the companies investing most heavily in A/B testing are also some of the biggest companies around. When they do A/B testing right, they can get more per dollar spent or risked than most other businesses, even if both do the things exactly the same way. So that's something to keep in mind. These fixed costs, which can be optimized somewhat, greater benefit during testing, that's something which you need to keep in mind if you are actually a small business and not simply encountering a small sample size problem within a larger business corporation, let's say. Now, before we wrap up, I'd like to mention a tactic I actually strongly discourage, which is sometimes suggested when the issue of a small sample size comes to the table. And this is purchasing ad traffic simply to send more users to a particular A/B test. While this will indeed shorten the duration of the test, it will also ruin the applicability of the conclusions from it, unless you keep up advertising in the same manner and bringing in the same types of users after the test is completed. In other words, the generalizability of the result will suffer, as the users you sample during the test will not be representative of those following the test, those which will experience your website or app afterwards. So in conclusion, having a small number of users, sessions or emails to test with certainly comes with disadvantages, but they are not always as insurmountable as they may seem initially. Skipping testing entirely can be justified in specific cases, but other solutions exist which make testing ROI positive. The key is not to use a one-size-fits-all approach. Tweak parameters, make trade-offs, which make sense, obviously, for the particular test. And this way you can use A/B testing efficiently as a tool for estimation and risk management, even with a small sample size. As discussed, you can take a disaster prevention approach with certain non-inferiority designs, or you can choose to accept higher uncertainty, higher risk of false positives, or you can accept a higher risk of false negatives. Using sequential testing is almost always beneficial since it reduces the expected sample size on average in all situations, and the trade-off involved is minimal. Like in some odd tests you'll have a slightly larger sample size. Another solution we discussed is that you can also switch to an alternative KPI, a next step KPI, instead of an overall business KPI, which makes sense and makes a test feasible in many situations. It should be noted that none of these solutions are unique to a small sample size situation, as these are all things which you can do to increase the efficiency of tests in general. I think, however, that these options are more of a necessity if your sample size appears prohibitively small. So if you have any questions or comments about this topic, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn, Twitter, or the contact us form at analyticstoolkit.com. And if you're interested in A/B testing statistics, you would also want to check out my upcoming book, Statistical Methods in Online A/B Testing. Simply search for Statistical Methods in Online A/B Testing in Google, or navigate to abtestingstats.com, where you can enter your email and join the waiting list and get notified when the book is out for purchase. Thank you all for your time and have a great rest of your day.